Hello, everybody. Welcome to Heartland series of podcasts. I am Emin Jabbarov, Executive Director of Expert Analytical Center Heartland. Today, we have a special guest, Roger Baker, Executive Director of Stratfor, RANE, Senior Advisor, member of Mackinder Forum, has different titles, different occupation, and a very interesting experience. Also, he teaches applied geopolitics in Florida Atlantic University and Business School. Yeah, we are honored to have him today. And before we start, I want to thank Narxoz University for giving the platform, the podcast studio, being our partner for different events and for this podcast. So, Roger, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So my first question is, applied geopolitics for business. It's very interesting. It is very new for Kazakhstan, for Central Asia, because in our region, in our country, geopolitics, geopolitical analysis is for geopolitical experts, for international relations experts. But something I have seen in the United States, I liked and I want to bring applied geopolitics for business, applied geopolitics for business school, for business community. What's your opinion? Does Kazakhstan business or Central Asian business need applied geopolitics for business?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that any business needs to be aware of their regional environment, the space around that, and the international environment. And Central Asian business is no different. Even if they're not running out around the world and investing all over the world, they have to be aware of that. Every company effectively is an international business these days. Their supply chains, the goods that come in, the things that go out, they're traveling across borders, often multiple borders before they get them. And they need to be aware of that. But in particular, if we think about Central Asia sits in a space that is, it's got Russia, it's got China, it's got Turkey, there's Iran sort of way off to the bottom of the Caspian, there's the Europeans with an interest in there, there's the United States in there, India is kind of coming up, Japan is trying to reach. There's a lot of things that move in and around and through Central Asia that interact in the space, that interact economically, politically, militarily in some cases, right? And so a change in China's investment strategy internationally based on relations with the United States or based on challenges that China is facing with internal social dynamics is going to have a big impact on a place like Kazakhstan. If Kazakh businesses are only looking at China in terms of very tactical business deals, or assuming because they put all this money into the country for Belt and Road that they're going to keep putting money into the country for Belt and Road, they may miss a change that's coming that you can often anticipate that will alter what type of money is going or where that priority is going to be. And if they're aware of that ahead of time, rather than say, oh, well, that's a risk, I can't do anything, they can say, okay, if that change is coming, how do I adapt and adjust to continue to find opportunity? Are there places that I can step into gaps? Are there places where I can be first in those relationships? But I do think there's a lot of reason why even businesses that don't think of themselves in big international terms really do gain from paying attention to and understanding these broader dynamics. They don't have to be geopolitical experts, but they have to learn to think geopolitically to understand that context.
Roger, there is like new geopolitical reality, let's say this way, let's frame it this way. The supply chain disrupted recently, yeah, after certain events in the Eastern Europe. Let's cover it this way, yeah. Central Asian countries looking for new roads, yeah, and there's a very fancy word, middle corridor. Central Asia, Kazakhstan, yeah, we to some extent we think that we are. I think any nation, any country in the world think they're the center of the world. Yeah, everybody thinks that any country thinks it's heartland, it's important, and they want to project this themselves on the market this way. But what is the perspective from US towards the Middle Corridor, Caucasus, Central Asia? Is it that important? Is there any priority in foreign policy this region, or we want so much to be prioritized, and that's not really the question? So what I want to say is that there is our perception, about our region, and what is the American perception of our two regions?
So one thing to keep in mind is that there's not a single American perception.
Definitely.
We have to understand that there's different ways of focusing on it. But if we step back, the United States is primarily a maritime trading country when it engages in international relations and trade. And then services. And services, it doesn't matter where some place is. Often services are now done digitally. So for the United States, it is more often actively aware and interested in countries that sit on the maritime periphery. And Kazakhstan, of course, does not. It is a long way from the maritime frontier to Kazakhstan. In that sense, the U.S. will, by default, prioritize resource locations like Brazil, like Chile, or thinking about trade with places like India or Japan, even China, which has that maritime frontier. It doesn't mean that there's no interest. When we think about it, though, from strategic interest, there's a couple of things that come up. Again, Kazakhstan sits at a very important location. It's part of this area right in between multiple powers that are of interest to the United States. From a strategic perspective for the United States, if the U.S. is trying to reduce the strength of Russia or China as challengers, it can do that at the maritime frontier, or it can do a traditional checkerboard strategy, do it behind the lines. Central Asia is a perfect place for that. Secondarily, because of the expansion of transportation corridors through this region, whether it's all of the east-west connectivity that China's been building, some of the north-south connectivity that Russia or India or other countries are talking about building, it's creating more access to a region that traditionally had very narrow access routes. The more access that's there, the more options there are for flows of trade in both directions, the more likely there would be more interest from the United States or from U.S. companies, Western companies, in being able to come in and position themselves either to see this as an emerging market, there's a large youth population in Central Asia, or to see it as a place where resources that traditionally were constrained to Russia, China, maybe to Europe, now open up and can move out to the international space. So I think there is that changing perception taking place in the United States.
So you would say that that big Chinese project, Belt and Road Initiative, being certainly facilitated U.S. interest in Central Asia. So if they invested in this project, they invested in the infrastructure. So would easily U.S. could go into that infrastructure?
Look, somebody else has already built the infrastructure, right? And now things can move. There's other economic activity that starts to happen around that. Now that creates opportunity to come in. The challenge is the Chinese are able to drive the action of their private companies or the state-owned companies. Mm-hmm. And so they can pair corporate activity with national policy. Mm-hmm. And bring in the money and the companies to develop the infrastructure with the intent of China selling their goods into it and getting the contracts and ultimately being able to use the transit routes. The U.S. companies will look and say, there is no infrastructure. It's too costly to go here. We have so many other options. Why go here? If the infrastructure is there, now it changes the cost the assessment by US companies as they look at it. Oh, look at that. There's easy rail access. There's easy road access. There's new airports being built. There's land transit ports being built. We can utilize that infrastructure. The relative cost drops, the relative value rises. Let's go. The US government can then give encouragement through additional outbound loans, through tax incentives, things like that. But usually only if the ground conditions are conducive from a business perspective first.
Interesting. Two different perception, two different strategies. I know that you did or you do business with Chinese businessmen. I know that you had experience. You went to China. If you may comment on geopolitical strategy of China in Central Asia, like if, as you mentioned before in your lectures, this deep strategy. If you go to like Mackinda, that very, very big strategies, Heartland. What is then Chinese strategy long term in terms of their Western neighbors, let's say, Central Asia, Caucasus?
So I think let's go back to Belt and Road Initiative and what drove China to really put money in that. Because even before the Belt and Road Initiative, there were talks of reviving the Iron Silk Road or anything like that. But there wasn't a lot of real strong push by China. It was sort of a lot of talk and a little bit of things here and there. But for the most part, again, if you think about a maritime trade, is so much cheaper in tons per mile than land trade, right? So rail is not cost effective compared to maritime trade when you're running from China all the way to Europe, unless time is your critical factor. But as we get to around the time that Xi Jinping takes over China, there's been a shift in Chinese economic activity such that China is really completely dependent upon international trade to keep its economy functioning and going. Whereas in the past, international trade played a role, but China could, and you see it in historical patterns, basically sort of shut itself off from the international system, focus internally, and then reopen after it has stresses. It can't do that anymore. It can't seal itself off. It's trying through cyber means to seal itself off from information, but it can't really seal itself off from the world. It needs that trade. Well, that trade moves by sea. And on the Chinese coastline, effectively the United States bottles in China, Korea, Japan, friendships in Taiwan, the Philippines. There's treaty allies with the United States. 3 of those. One is a partner. Then you go down to expanding U.S. relations in Singapore, in Malaysia and Indonesia. All these places. China is bottled in. The U.S. Navy dominates the world's oceans. It has the ability to open or close the oceans. So China looked at that and they said, we need a strategy. And there's basically 3 strategies a country in that situation can do. It can say, 1, we accept that the U.S.'s role is to keep the world's oceans open. They're going to keep them open for us too. No worries. But they were worried about that perception of U.S.-China competition. They can seek alternate routes. And then they can build a navy of their own and protect their supply lines. And they chose the last 2 of those. So Belt and Road Initiative, part of it was for interior China, but a lot of it was to say, can we create a variety of alternative routes such that if there is stress on our maritime route, it doesn't completely shut us down? No rail route is going to replace all of the maritime traffic. But can it lower the cost even a little bit? Can it give a few more options if there's stress in that area? And that opens space for China's strategic policy, strategic relations, and then build out their navy. Well, coming into Central Asia then, what was missing in Central Asia? You have these growing countries, they're there, but it was a lot of old Soviet infrastructure, right? China has used infrastructure as its primary tool of expanding economic relations and political relations, which layers into strategic relations. Central Asia is perfect for that. So they go in, they come in, they build rail, they build road, they help build cities, they build digital infrastructure, all of these things. What does that do? It gives China a place to put surplus labor. It gives China a place to put surplus Chinese production of steel and concrete and other things. It gives China access to future markets, all a net benefit for China. And therefore, it reduces the likelihood that those geographies become potential locations where a competitor could use them to challenge China. And then I think the other thing we have to remember in thinking about Central Asia is that, especially go back to about the early 2000s, China had a growing concern that the Islamic terrorism that was seen in the attacks on the United States was going to spread in China from Western China. And they started all sorts of changes in their Western China policy and their crackdown. They also started doing relations with their Central Asian neighbors to slowly build up collaborative counterterrorism, first information exchange, then training exchange, then ultimately in some places actually, forward positioning of joint counterterrorism operations and things of that sort. And initially that was counterterrorism. And then they started to look and say, how can we create perceptions of affinity? So play on the Silk Road connectivity, play on the long, deep history connectivity, instead of the Silk Road being something that's exploited by Turkey saying it was a pan-Turkic thing, pull it the Chinese side, pull it that direction, right? And I think that the Chinese coming into the region looked at it as a way, in a strategy of how can they do it in a way that is very different than the way the United States is perceived as acting, right? The United States goes in, dictates politics, dictates economics, dictates social policy. That's the perception, right? If the U.S. comes in, you need to be a better democracy. You need to do these things. You need to change all of these social norms, and then we'll work with you. And the Chinese came in and said, you have your social norms. We have our social norms. Let's not argue over which is better. Let's just do business. And that's very compelling.
It is. What do you think then? Can Kazakhstan be next Singapore, but terrestrial Singapore?
I mean, in the end, it won't match the level of Singapore because, again, the terrestrial trade won't match the maritime trade in sheer quantity. The other thing is, of course, Singapore is super tiny, so you really concentrated all of that in that very small point. And there are no, technically, I guess you could move back to Malacca as the primary port. It's the same location, but that strait is a very narrow strait. Everything has to move through that strait no matter what. What Kazakhstan offers, but that reduces that potential concentrated role, is it offers multiple potential routes, not one, right? It's not one choke point. It's a piece of a broader chain of transportation corridors across the region. So I think that Kazakhstan can benefit from that. If you think about its location, it can benefit from ultimately north-south and east-west. A really interesting thing to look at is, for the longest time, going back to deep geopolitics, right? Your heartland is the area inaccessible by sea and therefore inaccessible to the sea. You have to do a lot of land transport before you get to the sea. The Central Asian rivers emptied into the ice in the Arctic. So you couldn't use them as significant transit routes. Not a whole lot of heavy barge traffic to get into the ocean traffic like the U.S. has the Mississippi River, right? The Mississippi River drains the entire heartland of the United States. Heavy, bulk items, heavy items move cheaply on water instead of rail. With the opening of the Arctic, can Kazakhstan utilize its rivers to access Russian Arctic ports to push product out maritime that route as well? Now you start to see a Kazakhstan that is, yes, it's an east-west rail link. It's a north-south connector between Arctic routes and Indian Ocean routes. It becomes the Central Asia becomes this crossroads area. And really it's this, the Caucasus, Central Asia, it connects all of these routes. Now, they're not all built. They're not all going to be cost effective. They're not all going to be great. But it's the combination of them that creates new opportunities.
Certainly it is. Yeah, a very interesting idea. The Arctic connect Kazakhstan rather than middle corridor. The other potential, we used to, before the middle corridor, we used Russian, I guess. What was that? To Russian access through the Russia to the access to the Black Sea. But like, yeah, Arctic, something new, and I think they're going to be strong geopolitical rivalry in the Arctic. I mean, we have followed the news about Canada, U.S. making this new era of Trumpism, we call it. Yeah, the comments about Canada should join U.S. Greenland, buying Greenland. That whole specter of changing perception what geopolitics is. Yeah, so. I guess they're going to be very strong rivalry, China, Russia, and U.S. for the Arctic, because Arctic is melting. Yeah,
there is, but the interesting thing is that the NSR, the Northern Sea Route along the Russian coast, is a functional route now. Not great, seasonal, still very seasonal. All of the communications infrastructure, monitoring infrastructure is not completely there. Their transshipment ports at each end are starting to be built out. They're not finalized. But the change in ice patterns will make that route functional. Right now, a few months a year, in 10 years, 15 years, maybe almost year round. The Northwest Passage through Canada's Arctic, because of the ice patterns, will not be open for another 20 or 30 years. So in reality, the NSR is open, and it connects Asia and Europe. Huge trade relations there. Potentially, again, when you start thinking about minerals, when you think about heavy items, when you think about grain, things like that, can they utilize the Arctic river route and therefore be much lower cost in the transport cost, allow greater quantities to be moved, this type of thing. The U.S. doesn't really have a stake in that Russian Arctic. Where the U.S. intervenes is to say, we don't think things should move through Russia, or where the Europeans say, we don't think things should move through Russia, but we don't think that the Ukraine conflict is going to last forever. At some point, it's going to be wrapped up. Nobody's going to get everything they want. But at that point, you'll start to see a reduction of the extreme constraints on Russia as part of the ultimate negotiated settlement out of Ukraine. And that opens up some of these spaces. And again, the U.S. is competing in the Arctic, but not in the Russian Arctic. That's more of a China-Russia issue.
Interesting. So what's your forecast? 5-10 years and Russia will be, let's say, again, part of international law, part of international trade?
Well, I mean, 5 or 10 years, I think you will see Russia re-engaging and being re-engaged. I don't know what the status of international law is by then. We're watching some changes in the perception in Russia. International law is only effective so long as every country agrees to enforce it themselves, or one or two large powers enforce it on behalf of everyone else. And right now we're seeing less and less interest in that from the big powers, and therefore no interest in that from the small powers as such. International law reached a point where, because it considered Kazakhstan and the United States the same, Kazakhstan could win in a dispute in international law. Well, the big powers don't like that. They don't respect that. So it's not beneficial to them anymore. They'll just not pay attention to it so much. But I do think Russia will have some reintegration, but probably not to the level that it had. I don't necessarily see the pipeline networks being rebuilt. I think that perceived vulnerability has already moved on, and Russia's going to have to think about different routes, different directions. for a lot of their, the Germans are just not going to suddenly forgive everything that happened.
So I can refer to Roger Baker, senior advisor to Stratfor, thinks that middle corridor will be still in demand, because Russia, I agree with you, by the way, it won't be forgiven or forgot very quickly. The one generation will remember. The geopolitics will dictate still the past experience. So middle corridor would be in demand, like for, let's say, if we can foresight 15, 20 years, definitely.
It's a hedging strategy for so many countries. And so does it replace the key maritime routes? Not at all. But does it have a value in its alternativeness? I think it really does.
Interesting. Supply chain, very important. We discussed the Arctic, the Middle Corridor, Central Asia, Caucasus. What do you think about these two regions? Is it Central Asia, Caucasus, or is it Central Asia and South Caucasus? What's your perspective? To what extent we are connected as the two regions, or we are one region? I'm just curious about Western American perception about this two regions or one region.
So it all depends where you want to come at it from, right? If you are looking at it from a Western perception of corridors and routes and access, then it is a straight shot that connects Europe to Turkey to the Caucasus to Central Asia, right? And that has to be seen as a singular block, because you pull any one of them out and the whole system collapses. If it's from a perception of investment or even the way in which strategically one looks at the different regions of the world, they sort of operate, there's some overlap, but they're not the same. They have different dynamics. The Central Asia is far away from anything. The Caucasus sit right there in the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea connection. It's a place that, depending upon what happens with U.S.-Iran relationships, can really change, because it connects down to Iran, it connects over to Turkey, it connects up to Russia. It has its own unique sort of space and place, and what opportunities or risks there are. So I think, again, if it's just looked at from, we need these corridors and we want to utilize these corridors, you can't pull one piece out. They have to be looked at integratively. But if it's from strategic posturing, things of that sort, they will be looked at as different components. And even when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, right? The United States is an Indo-Pacific. There is no singular Indo-Pacific. The United States is not doing the same things with India that it's doing with Japan or Australia or the Philippines, right? These subcomponents of it have their own piece of the strategy, different than sort of that whole unit that's sometimes talked about.
Well, I'm particularly interested, what is the U.S. administration perception?
It's not clear, because I think you have to be aware that the U.S. administration has many different components within it this time. There's not a singular strategy. There are so one of the defining characteristics of President Trump's cabinets is that he places people in positions and allows them to fight over things, and whoever wins, wins. But he's not going and assessing each one and then seeing how they work together and then coming up with, this is the best balance of these. It's a winner space. And there are those who look at Central Asia out of this administration and say Central Asia is the place to be to really mess with the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians. And that brings you into the Caucasus as one whole space, right? If you want to keep the Russians and the Chinese off balance on the international space, you want to make sure that you are doing as much as you can, or at least as enough, not as much as you can, but enough in the Caucasus and in Central Asia to force Russia and China to constantly push attention and resources into that space, which reduces their ability to push out to the European frontier, the Western Arctic frontier, the maritime frontier for the Chinese. So I think that there's that view. There's a slice in the administration that looks at the region simply in terms of what can we get in regards to minerals, oil, gas, critical minerals, maybe some uranium here and there, things like that, right? And thinks of it in that very economic transactional component. And there is a view that, you know, the US, like the Chinese, needs to dominate entire mineral supply chains from mine head through processing to final consumption and product. And that's how China pushed out into mining and minerals, right? It owned the mine. It owned the roads to the mine. It owned the port that connected the roads to the mine. It owned the shipping company at the port. It owned the port back home. It refined it back home. And China built holistic supply chains of minerals that they owned every piece of and felt more strong. And there are those in the administration that are looking at that and saying the U.S. needs to do that so that it doesn't have risks and vulnerabilities to other people. Well, how do they do that? Look at everything. What was the deal in Venezuela? Well, we're going to have control in the oil. What's the deal in Greenland? We want control of the strategic minerals. What's the Central Asia? We want these relationships on these minerals. What's that policy? So I think that there's that slice. And then there's a slice that just looks at it and says, and this is not a small piece of the administration, that's far away. Why are we caring about it? Why do we want to get stuck? What's the worst place that the United States could possibly be caught up in a mess? Far from an ocean, far from our homeland, right? The Afghanistan was bad enough. Imagine being caught up in a mess in Central Asia. And so there is the America first, or the Western Hemisphere first component of the administration views Central Asia as just, why do we want to mess with that? It's gonna just get us in trouble. Our role should be back here, back home. We should just be focusing on our hemisphere. And so when you say, what's the U.S. administration view? The problem is there's not a singular view. And it may carry out policy that 2 or 3 of the subcomponents sort of agree on the initial actions, but not on what the outcome should be or what's the next steps. And then we see who's able to sort of fight and get that on the agenda or get some action on that next step.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Roger. So a lot of questions coming from what you just said. Yeah. Particularly, I'm interested Iran. Yeah. If U.S. needs the oil, the felts, then let's say they take Venezuela. Yeah. All the oil felts. Then Iran. They strike Iran. They change the regime. They take Iranians' oil felts. Okay. I mean, American companies invest, let's say, differently. Then such activity could undermine their relation with Gulf monarchies. Yeah.
And with Texas.
And Texas has a right always to leave the United States. Yeah. Can you comment on that? The strategy in the Middle East, United States.
So the initial intent of the strategy in the Middle East was for the U.S. not to have to be caught up in wars in the Middle East anymore. So every president since George Bush Jr. has tried to get out of the Middle East and refocus U.S. attention on the Indo-Pacific and maybe on the Western Hemisphere. And every president, including George Bush Jr., has been unable to get out of the Middle East. A new crisis emerges, a new crisis emerges, a new crisis emerges. So the initial strategy was, how does the U.S. basically say, Saudi Arabia, we're not going to pick on you for all these, just manage things in your part of it. Israel, manage things in your part. Turkey, manage it. Just get it done. We don't want to be part of this mess anymore. Why do we need forces in Iraq and Syria and everywhere? Yes, we want some in the Gulf states, but that's just basing. We're not interfering with your business. And I think that was the main plan. Then it got sidetracked by the Israel-Hamas conflict and by Israel expanding that to Iran. And Israel identified both the vulnerability in Iran in this moment of opportunity to do something that another strain of US policymakers has wanted for a long time, which is how do they disrupt, delay, or destroy the Iranian nuclear weapons program? Okay, stop Iran from having nuclear weapons. And so the US started engaging in that. Then there was the human rights component, which still exists in this administration, that was pushing the idea, oh, if Iran hurts its citizens, we need to go in. And that's about, that's a thin bit, but that was really more of a rhetorical tool, I think, in trying to deal with Iran. Most of the time, it hasn't yet been about taking over the oil. But I'm sure there are elements in the administration that are looking at that space and saying, if we can control the general balance of all the world's oil, we define and dictate prices, energy everywhere. There can't be another oil shock of the 70s. The Saudis, the Gulf states will never turn this around and dominate us. So I think that's in there. The challenge, as you raise, if the U.S. were to do a half regime change like it did in Venezuela and then have deals with the Iranians that it goes in, invests, rehabilitates Iran's oil, gets it on the international markets and things like that. Without a doubt, that is going to be a strategic risk for Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states because they have not yet made that transition away from their dependence on oil. They haven't built up the rest of their economy enough to start reducing their dependence upon the oil. And their swing control of oil prices is absolutely critical to maintain that. Imagine if the U.S. then, as the center, somehow managed to convince, and again, you got to figure out how they do this with businesses, convince their companies just to pump and pump and pump. Keep it going anyway.
Drill, baby, drill. Yeah.
But sink the price. Well, the challenge is, again, like I said, I wasn't being facetious on Texas. You sink the price and you drop, it used to be 60, they're holding out at 50, but you start dropping sustainably below $50 a barrel, and you're going to start stopping new investment and stopping the flow of a lot of the Texas oil. It's just not going to be cost effective, which means that by strengthening these other producers, you actually start to weaken the U.S. produced oil, which would seem to be opposite of what the administration asserts that it wants to do. So I think you want to watch the things, but I think there's a very strong component in this administration that says there are long-standing international problems that have just been like sand underneath your eyelid for decades. And we are the only administration who will just say, we're going to change them. Let's knock the Venezuelans out so that we can knock the Cubans out and be done with this mess of Cuba, Venezuela, risk on our Caribbean frontier, blah, blah, blah. Let's just remove the Iranians from the board. There's no more Iranian nuclear threat. The end. There can't be an Iranian nuclear threat. Which means if they manage to pull those two off, you know who's next in their sights? The North Koreans, right? Let's go do it. And if you look at all the U.S. strategic documents for years, it's been like the U.S. has to worry about Russia and China. Oh, yeah, and these other nations that are problems. And it's Venezuela, it's Iran, it was Iraq, it's North Korea. Clear the board. And I think that there is a belief by many in this administration that they're the ones who should finally clear this board because they're the only ones who are bold enough to do it, willing to do it. And that makes them much more risk tolerant in ways that you would think they shouldn't be if they're really America first or isolationist. It's this contradictory set of ideas within it that if I clear the board, then I can actually focus just on my space and countering China, right?
Interesting. So what he is saying that the strategy that Trump follows today was actually on the board 20 years ago. Yeah.
The interests were there, the strategy not. And again, I'm not sure it's a full strategy because if it was a full strategy, I would argue that it would be very different in looking at the way the U.S. is relating to Europe and its allies. Because if the U.S. really wanted to use these economic levers and military levers, it would do so much more effectively and much faster in coordination with its partners than in opposition to its own partners. So, but intent. And Trump first administration, originally wanted to bomb the Iranians, then wanted to deal, and then bombed the Iranians. With the North Korea, tried to strike a deal with North Korea, right? Almost was there, and then little things happened and it disappeared. But you look at the way they're talking to Venezuela, the way they're talking to Iran. So yesterday it was, we're going to bomb Iran. Today it's, we're going to talk to Iran. This evening it's, if Iran doesn't want to talk to us, then you'll see what'll happen. But get it, clear the board, clear it out, I think is there. And it's looking at all of the things that everybody says, nobody has ever solved this. And they're saying, oh, we have 3 more years, we're going to solve it all.
Interesting. You mentioned that also there is, if I understand correctly, there is a group in the Trump administration that want dominate all the, let's say, oil fields in the world, yeah, to project its power this way. But that reminds me the Rockefeller, 19th century, yeah. If we remember the book written by Daniel Yergin, I guess, The Quest, yeah, for the oil. I remember he described Rockefeller like dominated U.S. Drilling, yeah, oil drilling. Then he started conquering Europe. And I remember he had the intelligence service for his company, for the corporation, that was spying even in Tsarist Russia. And the intelligence said that there is in Maikop, in Grozny, in Baku, there is a big oil fields. Yeah, so America dominated one time in the world. Yeah, the oil fields, but something happened inside America when they decided to bring down monopolists. Yeah, Rockefeller. Yeah, would it be that again? As history, history does not repeat.
It rhymes.
It rhymes. Yeah, I forgot the.
I think it's not quite the same. Yes, there's some oligarchic tendencies in there and some desires to have those businesses do that. I would look at it a little different. It's not necessarily about the U.S. going out and dominating all of the oil in the world and things like that. This administration, many people in this administration are obsessed with vulnerabilities and susceptibilities to being dependent on somebody else. And the only way to reduce dependency is, as much as you can do domestically, and anything you can't do domestically, make sure that you have enough influence that it can't be taken from you. It can't cause you risk or threats. You look at the way the president talked about Greenland. No, we must have full title, right? But otherwise, it's not real. There's this sense that if you don't control it, you can't be reliant. You can't be sure that those routes are going to stay open. Those resources are going to flow. And so it's not exactly the same as, I want to go out and dominate and take over the world, but it may ultimately express itself that way.
Interesting. You mentioned Greenland. As far as I understand, there is agreement between Denmark and U.S. for the military building. Yeah. So why Trump? Certainly one of my opinion is that Trump raises the stake rhetoric in order to, when he start the military buildings, Denmark will be okay. Unless you are not occupying it, taking it, there will be more let's say susceptible, acceptable. Yeah, such actions. What do you think?
I mean, that's part of it. This administration has many times gone and said, we're going to go, we're going to turn the knob to 11. Mm-hmm. Really, they only want to do it to 7. Most people would only accept 5, but when they say 11, they get 7, right?
Yeah, yes, exactly.
And so we do see that a lot. But this president has, in his first term, wanted Greenland as part of the United States. He's not the first president to want Greenland as the United States.
Interesting.
There's been a long history of U.S. military assessments and political assessments that Greenland should be part of the United States for part of strategic security. It's that eastern bank of the shield that covers the Arctic space. And yeah, the U.S. has all of the relations in Greenland. It has the deals. It has the military bases. The reduction in U.S. forces in Greenland over the last 20, 30 years has not been because Greenland got mad and kicked them out or Denmark kicked them out. It's because the U.S. withdrew them and didn't care about the Arctic. Now they're having to deal with that. There are all sorts of arrangements to be able to go back, to be able to expand, to be able to do that. So, yes, there are other ways to do it, but I think in this president, some of it might be what you say. Some of it might just be a perception that if you go from the extreme, the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine ideal, then you want to dominate this hemisphere, and dominating the hemisphere means not having European interference in the hemisphere. Well, there are still a handful of European pieces of the hemisphere, of which Greenland is a very, very obvious one. We won't talk about French Guiana. We won't look at some of the Caribbean islands still. The British Virgin Islands are still there.
Yeah.
But Greenland is the real obvious piece. And the thing is that Greenland politically has moved from roughly 3 political ideas to 2. So it had a stay integrated with the homeland idea. It had a slow move towards independence idea, and it had a faster move towards independence idea. And in fact, the fast move towards independence ideal was rising.
Mm-hmm.
And there may have been some misinterpretation that the fast move to independence would be like, oh yeah, let's grab onto the U.S. and that'll help us. Misunderstanding that, with the exception of Texas, you don't declare independence from one country and then beg another country to take you quickly because you run out of money. There may have been a misperception of the Greenlandic politics, thinking that fast independence movement would then create the space for the United States to come in, step in, and exploit that, because it's a tiny population, tiny economy, things of that sort. What happened was, though, because of the Trump announcements, effectively the slow independence party gained power over the fast movement. And so it actually slowed down the independence of Greenland rather than sped it up, and reinforced the idea of Greenlandic identity. We don't want to be part of anybody else.
Interesting. Very interesting. So we start talking about the geopolitics, and we talk only about resources and roads. Yeah, I guess geopolitics it's not only about that. Yeah, there is also ideas. Yeah, as you also mentioned in your lectures. Yeah, that's also a sense of sovereignty, independency as idea, as a nation building is also important. Yeah, in Central Asia, also very new approach to create Central Asian identity. Like, if you know, till 1991 we didn't have a borders in Central Asia. We didn't have the borders. There's no for nomads, for semi-nomads, for this region, border does not make sense. Yeah, people moved freely. It was the different attitude to space. Yeah, special transformation. Yeah, this changed was very fast, and now we had very strong borders. All the countries so moved to have that border, strong borders. If you go, for example, from Shymkent to Tashkent, yeah, the two from border with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan border, you see the river, the grass, people are living, and there is the border, the wall, yeah, which does not really suit to this landscape, yeah. And another pillar, let's say, of geopolitics is idea. Like before in Central Asia, Islam was idea to bring countries together. Now there is idea of Central Asian identity. Yeah, what do you think, Roger? Such identities, such ideas to, like in Greenland, like we are Greenland, we used to be the great, or we have the right to be great. Yeah, also in Central Asia, such ideas, such new creation of identity. What's your thoughts about that? What's your
So I think there's a lot of really good historic examples to look at to think about the evolution of new identities based on new political borders that sit on top of spaces that don't necessarily match the political border. Think about much of the post-colonial world in Africa and South America, and European dictated borders that cross social and ethnical and linguistic lines, mix them up, don't align with what the reality is underneath. Some of those states have still struggle to have a true national identity. They end up with, you look at a Nigeria, and on the one hand you say, oh yeah, Nigeria they're Nigerian. Well, are they? There's a constant structural relationship between the North and the South that have to carefully balance political power and think. There's not a singular identity. There are still those underlying. You go to East Africa, you still see those. Sometimes an element of identity gets built up based on countering the other, right? Who's next door to you? Can you create an identity that's strengthened based on that? But a lot of places where borders have not been fought over for centuries and eventually settled with in certain ways, but we're just sort of imposed and placed there. It takes a long time to build that. Indonesia is a really good case of a country that was able, at least for a little bit, to build an identity and create something new. Indonesia wasn't the thing, You end World War II, and the Dutch had it, and the Portuguese had a piece of it, and different people had pieces. And Indonesia wasn't historically a single kingdom of its own. It was sort of amalgamated together, and there are very strong island identities across Indonesia. And Sukarno helped us shape an Indonesian identity out of the idea of post-colonialism, similar to what we see with the first creation of an Indian identity in post-colonialism, right? Really create an Indian identity that had never existed before.
Definitely.
Because it was so many different places. And then over time, those start to fragment and fade, and then something else comes in to redo it. And in India, for example, we're seeing a renewal of trying to recreate Indian identity once again, right? So the whole move back to calling it Bharat, and the BJP is trying to reignite Indian identity because each of the states compete with each other, stronger than American states compete with each other. You can cross borders between states and sometimes have to pay just to move goods across borders between states. So if you're trying to create a nation that is internationally competitive in trade, but there's 3 layers of taxes before they even get to the border,
yeah.
How do you start countering that by creating national identity? So I think here, there are. I would expect that national identity will be combinations of modernity, like the future look, and some anchor in some ancient history, right? Really try to tie to that to give the sense that that it's not a new state, that it's not a new place, that it's a long place. The challenge with that is going to be, does the anchor, do different people claim the same anchor? Do they fight over the anchor? Those types of things can come up, particularly as states are really trying to identify themselves and put that as their piece of the identity.
Interesting, very interesting. So, Roger, roads, resources, ideas. So, what will be the strategy for the Kazakhstan? Military strategy. As you know, I'm from military backgrounds. How we protect this one? All what we had in infrastructure, okay, but our resources, our identity, ideas, yeah, our roads, yeah, that we think, yeah, very we perceive as our national interests. What would be our strategy then?
So back to your roads and things, I use a 3R of roots, resources, and relationships. And if you want a quick and easy way to look at countries and their geopolitical patterns, you take those 3, right? And you look at them. So take a Kazakhstan, okay? What does it define as its core national interests? are there particular, what's the core of Kazakhstan? Is Kazakhstan core around Almaty? Is it around Astana? Where is the center of gravity of Kazakhstan? So that's the first question. It's not you ignore the borders, but countries have centers of gravity. If they have two and they're constantly challenging, then there's a whole internal question first before you can really start to think of that broader military strategy. And that usually means that the primary role of the military is defensive, purely defensive, just to hold enough of the frame so that the internal can deal with itself without too much interference. Then you look at what are the potential risks or opportunities around, right? And so for Kazakhstan, again, you get the Caspian doesn't count, so you have a landlocked nation, right? A landlocked country by default has to have relationships and reliable relationships with its neighbor to be able to access the international system. Otherwise, it isn't. And so it has default dependencies upon its neighbors that always give those neighbors, whether they are bigger or smaller, a little more power. Right? We see this when Ethiopia lost Eritrea, how every one of its neighbors, even though Ethiopia conceptually is a stronger country than a lot of its neighbors, they dictate because they have the access to the sea, right? So for Kazakhstan, it has to look at that and say, what's the way to balance that? So the first, before you do the military strategy, is the political strategy, because the politics defines the military strategy first, right? So if it is an intentional multi-alignment strategy, we need to be friends with and important to, as a transit route, as a whatever, to at least 3 or 4 different entities, not 2, because then you're just kicked around, but 3, 4, 5. This is Mongolia's poor problem, right? They have a third neighbor strategy, but they can never count on the third neighbor because the third neighbor can never get there because they have to go via China or Russia. So forget it. You don't have a third neighbor, right? Then you look at the military strategy and say, what is it? What are the real threats to Kazakhstan that require a robust military? And it's not that somebody is about to invade them right now, but are there those places? So one would be to look at what are the non-state issues that might reemerge. This region has had a history of problems with non-state actors before. And then what are the ways in which other countries are perhaps trying to overly assert their interests into Kazakhstan, that the military, not in an aggressive way, but can play a role to redefine, hey, wait a minute, this is, your influence can come, but this is the wall. And after that, it's not influence as much as it's just relationships. Let's back off. What are those spaces? Are there areas where population just there's just not enough population to give any true understanding of what's going on, and maybe things flow, and there may need to be a military dynamic there. So I think those have to be looked at together. And then the final piece, I think this is a really important piece, and I'll draw on Mongolia's example. Connect the military to the international interests of the country by creating the training and collaboration and cooperation with other countries, such that you can utilize Kazakhstan as a place for large-scale military training by other countries, right, in collaboration with the Kazakh military. Well, in doing so, who wants to invade Kazakhstan if half the time there's a U.S. Army battalion over here training, and half the time there's a German group training, and there's a French? Now you're interfering with all of these other countries as well, right? And then Kazakhstan can utilize its military. We will partner with you in managing this somewhere else, right? And so push it out there. Uganda did this, right? Uganda's biggest export is its military. It goes on, and that has built a greater perception of Ugandan influence, strength, and power in its region by doing it. So the military doesn't only have to be, how do we stand up to the threat? What are the ways to make the military something that's useful for multiple countries.
Interesting.
The geography here is great. There's extra space. It's a great place for additional training, new things. Foreign countries would love to be here because now you're in China's backyard, you're in Russia's backyard, right? And Kazakh doesn't have to choose one. The ideal would be to choose multiple and give them that strength.
You have to be very careful when you say backyard. When Bloomberg wrote a paper saying that something that there was a strong warning from China to Russia about its backyard, meaning Kazakhstan. When we had January events, there were a lot of backlash from Kazakh citizens. We are not backyard.
So to Kazakhstan, Kazakh is not anybody's backyard. To China, Kazakhstan is their backyard. To Russia, Kazakhstan is their sphere of influence. There's a competing sphere of influence. And this is the interesting thing in geopolitics. Geopolitics tries to not care about the niceties. Not to be a jerk about it, right? But to say, look, sometimes we have to look at it for what it is and then say, if that's what it is, and we have an ideal of this is where we would like to be, to get to where we like to be, we first have to truly understand what it is and then make the policies that will get us there. Because if we say, no, I just want it to be this, the policies that we make might actually be contradictory, because if you don't understand what the base is, the choice you make can flip that very, very quickly. And so when the United States looks at Kazakhstan, it doesn't look at Kazakhstan and say, there is a great power with the history of the Central Asian steppes. It looks at Kazakhstan and it says, the Chinese have put a lot in there and there's roots through there. The Russians have a lot of influence in there and roots through there. There's resources that we would like to develop. There's relations we would like to have, but we always look at it in the context of the big powers that are sitting around it.
Thank you so much for explanation. Thanks so much. So, if you know, Roger, we, Kazakhstan, we are very big participants of the UN. I know that Uganda as well, they're very good at that. They send a lot of peacekeepers. So, like last year in November, I gave a public lecture. We have here a center for peacekeepers operation. I gave the public lecture for our peacekeepers to rotate in Golan Heights in Syria. There's our company is on our own automobiles. We have our airlifting capacities. I guess Airbus A400 or A300, like big cargo aircraft. We deployed our troops by our own airlift expeditional forces. And this is something very interesting happening in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan wants to have more peacekeepers in the world. And when I gave the lecture last year in this Central of Peacekeeping operation, I have seen that Kazakhstan prepares someone from Serbia. There were students. I mean, they're soldiers, surgeons, or officers, I don't remember, from Serbia, China, and I know that Belarusia is interested as well to send for preparation to our center. That could be very, as you mentioned, very interesting approach to our military strategy, to have that more. Battalion, brigade, all over the world, so all the most powers in the world would share with us, this burden, let's say, this responsibility in peacekeeping operation, which will definitely hedge the risks, military security risks in foreign policy.
It's an interesting way to also gain influence and connectivity in relationships. So China did this. So if you go back 20, 30 years, China was very reticent to join international peacekeeping operations. Then they started sending police. And then they started shifting and they started sending military until China was one of the biggest contributors to peacekeeping. At the same time, the Chinese National Defense University was running entire just African country cohorts, entire Latin American country cohorts, building those connections with officers, with military folks. Europeans were I spoke twice at the Chinese National Defense University.
Interesting.
And the audience was mostly not Chinese.
Interesting.
It was the foreign students and the things. And so they were using these as ways to learn, to learn new skills, new techniques, new strategies, to build relationships for information sharing, for knowledge gaining, to build soft power, um, and to demonstrate that they were a responsible international player that was important to the international system. And the advantage that a Kazakhstan could bring over a China is that right now, Kazakhstan is not seen as it's in the Chinese camp or it's in the Russian camp or it's in the American camp. It's playing in that what traditionally would be the non-aligned space, or I think the multi-aligned space today, right? So going to Kazakhstan is not necessarily going to gain the ire of the Americans as if you sent your delegation to Beijing or to Moscow. It's not going to make the Chinese mad as if you sent them to the United States or so. So I think there is that opportunity in this space for that to be used as a way to, it doesn't translate one-to-one into power and influence, but it starts to build that buffer, that sense of significance, importance, and value of the country to multiple spaces. And by doing so, again, you create other options, and it reduces the relative gap in pressure that other countries can put on Kazakhstan.
That what middle powers do.
Yeah.
That will be perfect. Our foreign policy strategy, especially in terms of military security. Yeah, very interesting. Another question coming from me, which also I think people will be interested. NATO East expansion. What's your forecast? Like, what is the U.S. strategy or NATO strategy? Like, U.S. leaving a bit NATO, Caucasus countries, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, in near future, let's say 5-10 years, will be in NATO. 20-30 years would be part of NATO or not?
So I don't think in the 5 to 10 year range we're going to see any more NATO expansion.
5-10 years, no major.
I don't think there's any more NATO expansion in that time frame, barring the total collapse of Russia. And if we had the total collapse of Russia, it's not clear that NATO would hold together. That the U.S. would determine that it needed that much of a presence in the North Atlantic, and it would really push that to the Europeans. So, and the other thing is everybody would be focused on what do you do with if Russia were to collapse. This is something people are like, oh, we want Russia to collapse. They're forgetting that the last collapse was a managed collapse. And in the managed collapse of the Soviet Union, there were long discussions over what to do with the nuclear weapons so that they would be concentrated only in one part of the former Soviet Union, in Russia. If Russia were to collapse today, that wouldn't be a managed, happy little thing. You would suddenly have Chechen nuclear weapons. The Russian Far East would own 3 nuclear submarines. Like, there's a whole lot of chaos that would be going on if that happens.
Definitely.
Right? But I don't think that I think NATO at the moment is looking and saying, even if it wants to claim that the opportunity is there for future NATO expansion, it's not going to actively pursue it. NATO has a lot of internal reshaping to do. It just expanded and brought in a couple more of the northern countries. They haven't been fully integrated into all of that model. There's the questions of what role the U.S., new defense spending, the big debates over, what's the relationship between NATO and the European defense initiatives. All of that is going on. I think we're at a pause on NATO expansion. Even if they'll tell Ukraine or Georgia, yes, you're still on track. I just don't see them moving on that anytime soon.
Thank you so much. Russian-Ukraine conflict. What's your foresight? What's your forecast when the war ends?
It's over. This is the thing. The general contours of the Russia-Ukraine crisis have been pretty static for the last year and a half. It is reminiscent of after 1 year of the Korean War, the other 2 years, the outcome was clear, The exact timing and the exact which ridge was in which side of the line was not. But the outcome was pretty clear. Nobody was having the capability, the capacity, the willingness to do any major additional movement in either direction. And I think even if Russia wants to, we're watching, they're just not having the ability to make that move. Europe and the United States are giving just enough to Ukraine to keep them, not enough for Ukraine to really make a major counter push. The question will be, how big is the buffer space? There's the details that need to be worked out. How big is the buffer space? Certainly, Ukraine can't afford to have Russia up against the river, because if they're on the east bank of the river, then effectively they have the ability to quickly cut off Ukraine's ability to utilize the river for any trade, any reliable, it further undermines. So the buffer space has to be from the bank of the river east. How far east, it's not clear. Who patrols the buffer space, it's not clear. My gut is it's going to still be the Europeans ultimately, and other folks are going to be in there. But that's the general structure is kind of obvious. The details are not there. And for Russia, I think they look at the chaos in the US-European relation and feel that there's no rush. They can just sit and grind and grind and grind. And the longer they grind, it doesn't necessarily give them a greater chance of winning. But what it does is it further undermines Ukraine's confidence in relying on Europe, Ukraine's confidence in relying on the United States, such that in a end of the moment, when it's all done, maybe they've got a Ukraine that's like, we just don't want to fight Russia anymore. We're not going to be pro-Russia, but we're not going to be pro-NATO. Right? That's, I think, what they're hoping, why they're delaying. If the United States really wanted it to be over, it would work with the Europeans. They could put massive amounts of economic pressure on Russia and massive amounts of a surge of military capabilities into Ukraine, and they could compel Russia to make that decision to stop and come to it. But neither the U.S. nor the Europeans are making those moves also.
So there is no interest of the U.S. or Europeans.
I think that the Trump administration would have liked the war to be over 2 days after winning office. Would like it to be done at least 2 to 3 months before the November election to show it as another victory. They don't want to get to the November election and still you haven't solved the most important of the crises, right? They solved all the other wars in the world, so this one needs to be resolved. I think that there will be a growing sense of maybe not urgency, but it's going to pick up in the U.S. over the next month and a half. They seem to be close to a fuzzy deal. I don't think we come out with a peace agreement. I think we come out with an armistice and a fuzzy space in there, and let the Europeans make certain promises and things of that sort. And for this administration, I think what they want is that it doesn't restart before the end of the term.
Thank you so much, Roger. Thank you so much. Another question about the forecasting, if I may. US-China war in the Strait of Malacca Strait, in that maritime road.
The Taiwan War.
Taiwan war, yeah. Is it like, are we going to see that 5-10 years happening?
So in the 5 to 10 year range, I think it is plausible that we move towards conflict in that space. In the 1 to 3 year range, I think it's highly unlikely, despite the heavy attention to 2027, which was an arbitrary number, but there was other reasons why that number was thrown out. But the longer run, it is plausible, depending upon how the U.S. is shaping its position, Japan is expanding its access. Even though we hear a sense of urgency potentially out of the Chinese military folks and Xi Jinping, or it's perceived that way, barring a fundamental change in Taiwan's position or its relations with these countries, there isn't anything that compels action quickly. Now, Russia invaded Ukraine with nothing that compelled action this last invasion. There was nothing going on that was compelling it. And talking to the OSCE and folks over there, everybody was basically saying, when I was over there in 2018 in Ukraine, they were like, they're 12 years away from being close to ready for NATO membership. So there was no pressure. That was seen as a window of opportunity. And there is the perception that if there are certain things that happen in the United States, China might see a window of opportunity. They would, at this moment, I think they would only try to take Taiwan by force if they were confident that there would be no direct response from the United States and Japan at this moment, because they need that to be confident of victory without the total destruction of Taiwan and the total loss of international trade connections, et cetera, et cetera. Down the road, as the balance shifts, as they see things going on, that might change. The biggest challenge to China is demographics in Taiwan. And that is, each year when you look at the polls in Taiwan of what is Taiwan, back to identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you identify yourself? And the options are Chinese, Taiwanese, or both. And over time, those who identify them as Chinese have nearly dropped to nothing. And those who identify as both are collapsing. And Taiwanese identity is a unique idea, separate from Chinese identity, is growing. And it's logical, right? The Taiwanese moved to the island in 1949 when they were kicked off the mainland. But we're a couple of generations
Exactly.
of Taiwanese who have only been born where? On Taiwan. They only identify as Taiwanese. They have no familial, they have no connection to the mainland. They have no, and we've seen the same thing in South Korea. The Youngdo have no interest in unification. The North Korean leader has declared they don't have an interest in unification, right? The identity is growing. And the risk for China is that at some point there is no plausible opportunity for non-aggressive unification, right? There's just no interest in it. The economics start to crack. The social identity is already gone. Why come in? And that's a risk for the Chinese that I think does put a little bit of perception of pressure on them to say, what can we do to change that? The economic incentives are not working anymore, and the economic threats are not working anymore. So all they have is military coercion, and the problem is military coercion only reinforces the contrarian identity.
Thank you so much, Roger. Last question, if I may. I know you read a lot. Who doesn't know, I was a student of Roger Baker back in Florida Atlantic University on campus courses. Yeah, this man reads a lot. I would ask you recommend to our audience 3 books on strategy and 3 books to read on geopolitics.
So strategy, I'll give you one right off the top of my head, and that is The Grand Strategy of the Habsburg Empire by A. Wes Mitchell. If you really want to understand the intersection of strategy and geography and of strategy built out of limited options, that is an absolutely excellent book to read on strategy.
Something matches Kazakhstan foreign policy.
I wasn't going to say that, but yes. So the grand strategy of the Habsburg Empire. On geopolitics, I'm going to go back to some of the basics, right? I think everybody needs to go back and read Democratic Ideals and Reality by Halford Mackinder, and read it, not just skim through it, but try to put it in the context of when it was written, what came out, and more importantly, why. Look at it not for what it tells you, but how it approaches things. The same with Nicholas Spikeman's last book, The Geography of the Peace, which he writes before the end of World War II because he dies. But The Geography of the Peace, wonderful, not perfect prediction, not anything, and things like that. Wonderful, really good introduction to understanding the geographic connections and components in there. And then there's hundreds and hundreds of other ones to read, but I would throw out what's his name? There's a British author. I'd have to come back to you on it, but it's an older author. He writes a really interesting book on the relationship between geography and history, and that's something Gordon something. Anyway, it's on. I know exactly where it is on my bookshelf. Back to strategy. There's some great classic books by Colin Gray that are worth going and picking back up. You wouldn't do bad with almost any of them. So I won't say you have to pick one or the other or the other. I think that's there. And then it doesn't hurt to go back to the classics, right? Go back and look at Thucydides and look at the strategies that you see come out there.
Thucydides, yes.
Go back and look at some of these things. Even if you disagree with their strategies, go back and look at A. Little Hart and what he was writing about strategy, or Corbett versus Mahan on strategy and things of that sort. I think those give you insights, not to say that's it or it's wrong, but to say, how are they approaching it? What are they looking at? What's the context of the time? What's the context of history? What's the context of technology? What are they seeing? And then what does it come? Mackinder's Heartland theory was driven both by his observation of the horsemen and then applying that in the future to rail. He saw what the Prussians were able to do with rail, and he said, what if that rail network came out of Central Asia instead of the horse network? What would that do? And ultimately, it wasn't built until now.
Until now. Belt and Road. Yeah. Thank you so much, Roger. Again, Roger Baker, Senior Advisor, Executive Director of Stratfor RANE, part of Mackinder Forum, great speaker, trainer, coach. Yeah, teaches at Florida Atlantic University Business School. I myself applied for that course on campus. I got great experience, great knowledge, especially great methodology to embrace, comprehend international relations. Thank you so much, Roger.